Go ahead, take a look at the Bible on your shelf. Now, what if I told you that what you're holding is the theatrical cut? Yeah, a streamlined version of a much, much older and way more complex story.
I mean, think about it like this, right? The studio puts out a 90-minute movie for everyone to see. But somewhere out there, there's a 4-hour director's cut with all the original scenes left in. For centuries, the Western world has basically known just one version of the Bible. But way over in the highlands of Africa, a much older, way more expansive version, well, it's been preserved.
Get this. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, we're talking one of the oldest Christian communities on the planet, has a biblical canon of up to 81 books. 81! It's packed with ancient texts that were just left out of the Western Bible.
And we're talking about texts like the Book of Enoch, which, wow. It tells the story of fallen angels, giants, and celestial secrets so explosive it pretty much changes everything you thought you knew. So you have to ask, right? Why were these texts cut, and what truths could possibly be hidden inside the pages of this more ancient African canon?
Okay, so let's really dive into this. To get the full picture, you've got to understand that there isn't just one Bible. That's the key. Think of it less like a single book and more like a whole library with different collections on the shelves.
And here's where you can really see the difference in scale. Most of us in the West, we know the Protestant Bible with its 66 books, right? Or maybe the Catholic Bible, which has 73. But the Ethiopian Orthodox canon? That's a whole different ballgame, with up to 81 books. That's not just a few extra pages, folks. We're talking about a fundamentally larger library of sacred texts.
And this isn't some recent thing either. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church goes all the way back to the 4th century, and it developed its traditions pretty independently. I love this analogy. Imagine a branch of a family that moved to a remote island centuries ago, and they held on to all these old family stories and photos that everyone else kind of forgot about. Because this church grew outside the direct influence of the Roman Empire, it became this perfect time capsule, preserving a much older version of Christianity.
So the big question is, how did the Western Bible end up shorter? Well, let's tackle a really popular myth about how all these books were supposedly cut.
You've probably heard this one. There's this huge conspiracy theory that blames everything on a single event, the Council of Nicaea. The story goes that a bunch of bishops got together in a room and just voted on which books to keep and which to toss out. It's a really juicy story, full of political drama.
But here's the thing. Historically speaking, it's just false. The Council of Nicaea's main gig? It was to settle these huge theological debates about the nature of Christ, not to decide what was in or out of the Bible.
The real process? It was way slower, and honestly, a lot more organic. It wasn't one big vote. It was much more like a community putting together a playlist over hundreds of years. You know, in the early days, different churches had their own little mixtapes of sacred texts they had on repeat. Then, over time, through councils like Hippo and Carthage, the community slowly started to agree on what the official greatest hits album should be.
So how did a song make it onto this greatest hits album? It wasn't just random. They basically asked 3 big questions. First, apostolic origin. Was it written by one of the original artists or someone in their inner circle? Second, doctrinal alignment. Did it actually match the band's signature sound and message? And finally, widespread use. Was it already a fan favorite the congregations everywhere were, singing along to? If a text didn't really hit all those notes, it just kind of got faded out over time.
Which brings us to probably the most famous B-side in all of biblical history, the one track that was very deliberately left off the album, the Book of Enoch. And oh man, its story is absolutely wild.
So the most famous part of Enoch basically takes this one mysterious little passage in Genesis and just, blows it wide open. It describes this group of rebellious angels, they're called the Watchers, who got bored with their celestial duties, and, filled with lust for human women, they just straight up abandoned heaven and came down to earth.
And these Watchers, they had kids with human women. And their offspring? They were the Nephilim, a terrifying race of bloodthirsty, destructive giants who ate up all the resources on Earth and then, get this, started to devour humanity itself.
But it gets worse. The Watchers did more than just create giants. They taught humanity forbidden knowledge. We're talking the secrets of making weapons, sorcery, cosmetics, all of it. This corruption became so total, the story goes, that God basically had no choice but to hit the reset button and cleanse the world with the Great Flood.
So
why on earth would you sideline a book with a story that massive? Well, you have to put yourself in their shoes. For an emerging church trying to create a single, clear, unified message for a huge empire, Enoch was, well, it was a theological headache. Who exactly wrote this? What are we supposed to do with these crazy detailed family trees of angels and giants? It just complicated the simple, powerful story of human sin and redemption. It was way easier to just leave this complex track in the archives than to try and force it onto the main album.
Now, the fact that Enoch was pushed aside in the West is what makes its survival in Ethiopia so incredible. See, Ethiopia's church wasn't shaped by the politics of the councils of Rome. It was defined by its own completely unique history.
And you can really see the two different paths they took right here. On one hand, you had the Roman way. Christianity there was shaped by imperial politics. They needed a simple, unified doctrine to hold a massive empire together. But the Ethiopian way, totally different. It grew up in an independent kingdom, protected by its geography, and that allowed it to preserve all of its ancient traditions without that same pressure to, fall in line.
This independent identity is just so powerfully captured in Ethiopia's national epic, the Kebra Nagast. This text tells the incredible story of how the Ark of the Covenant was brought to Ethiopia, which basically positioned the nation as God's new chosen people. And that profound sense of divine purpose, it created a culture that fiercely protected all of its sacred texts because they saw them as a sacred inheritance.
So when it all comes down to it, what does this all mean when we compare these two Bibles? We're not just counting books here. We're looking at two totally different approaches to faith and to history itself.
Okay, let's go back to our music analogy one last time because it's perfect. The Western canon, that's the greatest hits album. It's perfectly polished, refined, and curated to give you a clear, unified message. But the Ethiopian canon, that's the deluxe collector's edition box set. It's got all the hits for sure, but it also has the raw demos, the experimental B-sides, the liner notes with alternate lyrics, and all the controversial tracks the record label desperately wanted to hide.
And all this leaves us with a really deep question, doesn't it? Is the truest version of faith found in that streamlined scripture, the one that was standardized for the whole world? Or is it hidden away in the ancient monasteries of Ethiopia, in the books that the rest of the world decided to leave behind? I'll leave that with you to think about.